And I'd like to talk about the One Big Beautiful Act bill. Oh my God, the OBBBA.
Yeah, we need a different acronym so it rolls off the tongue a little easier.
Triple BA.
Yeah, sounds like a bond rating.
Welcome to the HFR Podcast. My guest today is Ken Matheny, a career economist and Director of Macroeconomics at the Budget Lab at Yale. Ken, it's wonderful to have you on the show with us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And I hear you've just moved, so I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. I wonder if you could describe briefly the mission of the Budget Lab and what it is you strive to do there.
So the Budget Lab is a fascinating place. I've been here for about a year. It was founded approximately 2 years ago. The Budget Lab is a nonpartisan research group focused on kind of a holistic analysis of the effects of fiscal policy, government policy, particularly on the fiscal side. But we're not limiting our scope just to fiscal effects, that is the impacts on the federal government budget, but also looking at sort of broader whole economy impacts, and not just in the short run either, but also over the very long run. So it's a big picture, analytically driven, nonpartisan. We don't have a policy agenda or a policy viewpoint. We try to be as objective as circumstances allow us.
Yeah, I know you've been in the private sector. You were at Market Group and S&P Global. Do you think investors and asset managers pay enough attention to the details of fiscal policy, or is there just too much focus on Fed watching and monitoring the monetary policy rate?
Well, there's certainly a lot of the latter. You're spot on about that. Do they pay enough attention? That's hard for me to say. I'm not in their shoes, but I will say that there are absolutely very, very substantial consequences, both directly and also in terms of thinking about risk climate, longer term trends, and so forth. So having a good handle on what's happening in terms of government policy, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about fiscal issues here, is, I would think, important to anybody in an investment framework or asset management framework.
Yeah. One of the things I've noticed is there's suddenly a lot of the view that the United States has entered an era of fiscal dominance. And I would like to ask you, as someone who researches welfare effects, amongst other things, how does an era of fiscal dominance impact American households and American firms?
Wow, that's a hugely important question. That's a great big one to start with. I think the first issue, what do we mean by fiscal dominance? So where I want to go with this, I think there's sort of two, and they're very related, two sort of big tracks to this. One is the pressure that it puts on monetary policy in particular. And that is whether the monetary authority, so Reserve, if we're talking about the US, to the extent that there could be pressure to adapt monetary policy for political objectives. And in particular, one that you might hear about is whether or not monetary policy should include issues of trying to keep the cost of financing government debt or any other particular kind of debt as low as possible. And in some broad sense, that is consistent with the Fed's goals as mandated to it by Congress, which includes, among other things, financial stability. And as you know, also low inflation, low and stable inflation, and promoting maximum sustainable employment. The issue is when fiscal issues, fiscal objectives get in the way of monetary policy decisions that are intended to support the other two goals. That is, to support the dual mandate assigned by Congress. So one is this issue on monetary policy. And I guess for being concrete, one would be, okay, shouldn't the Fed just lower interest rates, keep them as close to zero as practical for as long as possible? And you'd say, okay, well, that sounds great. Let's make borrowing costs lower. But in fact, it's really counterproductive because it would tend to, over time, force up inflation expectations. And we know that inflation expectations are if not the key driver of long-term interest rates and long-term borrowing costs. And that's not something the Fed can offset by simply lowering short-term interest rates to an arbitrarily low level. So any kind of a policy, any movements in that direction are likely to be severely self-defeating. So that's the first major issue. And, we could dig in further, but on the monetary policy side. The second and not unrelated issue has to do with the safe harbor premium. The notion that the U.S. enjoys substantial benefits because of strong, stable financial markets, respect and protection of property rights, clear, clear legal framework that global investors view as offering a lot of sort of operational and financial security. And what are the benefits of that? The benefits are that the greater we here in the US, enjoy lower borrowing costs, higher asset prices than we would otherwise. Our financial markets are more robust and more liquid, in part because of the safe harbor premium and the way global investors view the US. So to the extent that fiscal dominance might lead to concern that the stability, both fiscal and economic stability, may be questioned or at risk in the future, that safe harbor premium could disappear. And the consequence of that would be much higher interest rates, not just for the federal government potentially, but also for all private borrowers, whether you're a homeowner, a business person, trying to finance capital, equipment, computers, what have you. So borrowing costs across the board could be much higher. The cost of raising equity finance, for example, could be higher in that sort of an environment. So I would be concerned about the risk to the safe harbor premium that we currently enjoy.
Can I throw in a wild card question in there? There's a lot of interest and excitement about crypto in general, stable coins in particular, kind of meshing crypto with the monetary system as we know it. And I think, there might even be this curiosity of how can we disengage from the done way of doing things where everything is really reliant on inflation expectations and interest rates. There's this view that this antiquated system is going to go away. We're going to switch to a digitized, cryptified monetary system. You see that happening? And do you think, yes, we might get there one day, but are the costs going to be potentially, is there a risk that they will be too destructive in the interim?
Wow, great question. I don't know that I'm going to be able to tick off, each parts of that, and there are many really significant parts to that. But there's a couple of things that I would suggest, and just as a disclaimer, this is not something that we at the Budget Lab have looked at in a careful way. So I'm just going to offer you some general thoughts here. First, what we've heard from the Fed over the last few years is there's been interest in the issue of a central bank digital currency, but the Fed does not appear to be headed in that direction, at least not in the foreseeable future. Could that change? Sure. Anything could change. And future board of governors and chair of the Fed 5 or 10 or 20 years down the road may have a different viewpoint. But if the Fed, so specifically speaking to the US, if the Fed ever got to the point where it was seriously considering issuing a central bank digital currency, they'd go to Congress. Both Janet Yellen and Jay Powell have at times said they'd have to go to Congress in order to get any kind of approval or buy-in before they would seriously consider doing it. So I don't think that's something that's going to happen in the near future. The other issue that really strikes me here is and this goes back to the previous question about where I brought up the issue of the safe harbor premium, and that is the sense of security. So the dollar as a reserve currency is a reserve currency for a variety of reasons. One is the preservation of property rights and the transparency of ownership. When you have a digitized asset, okay, now I'm going to move away from the central bank currency and talk about a private, say, stable coin that's maybe even linked exactly to the dollar and in theory is 100% backed by the dollar in some sense, maybe by holding treasury bills or something of that nature. You now have injected a private agent into that value stream. And now your perception as a holder or potential holder or recipient of that asset is, can I trust this other agent that's managing the fund that's, running the stable coin, so to speak? So you're injecting another layer of potential risk and uncertainty. And, just like from my standpoint, would I rather have a claim on the dollar, say through a bank account or entering treasury bills, or would I rather have it as a stable coin? Now, it's not a black and white issue because, as you know, a lot of our assets, in fact, we have third parties all the time. Whether we're talking about exchange traded fund or whatever it is, we have third parties that are in essence managing our assets and are responsible in some sense. So this is not a completely unique issue with stable coins and crypto more generally, but I do think it's an issue that would have to get resolved to the broad satisfaction of investors before something like this can truly take off in a wide diffuse way and sort of reorder the way we manage liquidity.
So I'm going to take us back to the more traditional aspects of government policy and what the Budget Lab specifically analyzes. And I'd like to talk about the One Big Beautiful Act bill. So it extends the 2017 tax cuts, which widely are perceived to primarily benefit high-income earners. It includes some additional tax cuts, but it also leaves a high fiscal deficit in place and a growth rate for that deficit. So on balance, in the research that the Budget Lab has done, does this One Big Beautiful Bill bring us closer to a situation where private investment is crowded out in the economy?
Well, that's a really important issue. The quick answer is yes. And let me just step back for a second to put a little context in that. So you're right that the budget bill did effectively cut a variety of tax rates, including effective income tax rates on both business incomes and personal incomes. There were also some cuts in tax, or let's say more favorable expensing provisions for certain types of business investment and equipment and research and development. So there is a massive expansion or very substantial expansion in the federal deficit because of the budget bill that drives up debt over time. In the near term, you do get some fiscal stimulus that boosts growth, boosts GDP a little bit in the short run. But the much more dominant, much more important and significant effect quantitatively is the crowding out effect, that interest rates, because debt is rising more rapidly with this bill than without, would be rising even without the budget bill. But with this bill, it's rising more rapidly. So that puts further upward pressure on interest rates over time. It crowds out investment. And in fact, that crowding out effect after the first couple of years more than dominates, more than offsets the stimulative effect to business investment through more generous expensing of certain types of equipment and intellectual property, or R&D. So when we did the analysis, what we found was you do get, taking into account all the elements of the bill, including the short run fiscal stimulus and the more favorable expensing provisions that I alluded to. So in the short run, you do get a little bit of a boost to GDP growth. So this is the level of GDP percent difference from what it would have been had the bill not been enacted. And so what you can see in the early part of this is a small boost to GDP. So GDP growth is a little bit higher, raises the level of GDP above its baseline. At the peak, it's about 0.7% above baseline. It's a pretty modest effect, and it doesn't last for very long. And the reason is crowding out in the main. So interest rates are going up, and over time, they did continue to go up, exactly as this chart indicates. So this is a chart of the 10-year Treasury yield. This is the percentage point boost to the 10-year Treasury yield over the next 30 years as we attribute to the enactment of the budget bill. And you could see you get a little bit of short run, a little overshooting in the short run. The 10-year yield gets pushed up because the Fed has to respond to the extra stimulus, and it wants to keep inflation and inflation expectations in check at or close to 2%. Then you kind of have a little bit of a give back there. The 10-year yield comes back down a little bit, but over the long term, you have this consistent and intensifying upward pressure on interest rates that leads to successively greater amounts of crowding out. And then if you go back to the chart that you showed just a second ago, that helps explain why the GDP impact not just gets negative, but it gets worse and worse and worse, more negative over time. And that's because these crowding out effects are pretty substantial. So by the end of, say, in this 30-year window that we looked at, GDP is about 3.3% lower than it would have been. That's real GDP. And the 10-year Treasury yield is about 140 basis points higher than it would have been. Now, let's be clear. No one really knows, and we don't pretend to know exactly what the impact would be on interest rates, and hence all the downstream impacts, including the amount of crowding out, is certainly open for discussion and debate. And in fact, there are scenarios where the interest rate impact could be smaller or larger. But I think it would be, there's no question that interest rates would be pushed up. One thing I would keep in mind, and this will take us back to that very first question about the safe harbor premium, is the possibility of sort of a upset in financial markets if investors in treasuries, for example, just to begin with, get concerned that the U.S. will have a hard time bringing its debt and deficit trajectories under control. But if global investors become concerned about that, you could see flight away from the dollar, away from treasuries, and perhaps away from all sorts of U.S. dollar-denominated assets or claims on the U.S. And that could be extremely disruptive. So I'm not saying that's what's going to happen in 10 years or even 30 years, but the risk of that gets greater the further we go into this process of having debt continuing to grow, not just grow absolutely, but grow relative to GDP. So in our analysis, by the end of the 30-year window, debt to GDP is nearly 200% of GDP. To put that in context, right now, we're at about 100% of GDP. So it's a near doubling of the size of government debt over 30 years relative to the size of the economy.
Right. That's the very crowding out we're talking about. So if foreign investors are not willing to put their money with us through long-term bonds and so on, they lose faith in U.S. financial markets. They're not sending their funds this way. They're moving away from the dollar. On balance, that impacts the growth potential of the U.S. economy from the private sector, as well as having this growing debt burden in the public sector.
I think you put it very well. It's both the cost of servicing the debt goes up over time, and then that problem is exacerbated, or that challenge is exacerbated by the fact that we're actually shrinking the economy over time because of the crowding out effects. So this doesn't happen right away. It takes a few years before those crowding out effects really become material, but they're inexorable.
Got it. So the more I sit back and think about what the administration is trying to achieve, I can kind of see the big picture that they want to paint, where there's tariff-driven revenues, which are up, and painful as it may be, it's driving structural change in the in American industry. There's also tax cuts at the top of the income bracket, but also loosely to reward enterprise. Locally, lower short-term interest rates to encourage some manner of borrowing and spending, and stricter immigration to keep out entrants into the country and the labor market. And then one more not insignificant, I think, change, which is this push to shift towards a new format of digital record keeping and payment systems by integrating stable coins into our payment systems as much as we can. If we look at this, does it gel together? Does it open up opportunities? And what is the likelihood of success that this big gamble works, that there's a paradigm shift and it works out?
Let me address a couple of parts, and this may not be fully satisfying, but I'll do my best here. You brought up the issue of tariffs, and yes, they're bringing in revenues. The revenues are lagging a bit behind what you might have thought if you just looked at the sort of change in statutory tariff rates by country and commodity. But I think they'll catch up. Within the next several months, our revenues will sort of catch up to the new regime if we just kind of hold steady, if we don't change those tariff rates from where they are today. Once we get past this short run transition. But what's the scale of the revenue? So the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, recently released a short report. And I'd say in a fairly optimistic scenario, they judged that the recently announced tariffs could generate between $3.3 and $4 trillion of revenue over the next 10 years, a large number by any metric at all. But that's not enough to fully offset the costs of the budget bill. Or let me put it differently. Excuse me. It's not enough to stabilize debt. So yes, it will offset a lot of the cost of the budget bill. And that's if those, I would say, somewhat optimistic revenue projections actually are borne out. Because one of the things we know is anything that we tax or tax more heavily than we have in the past, any activity people tend to find, and businesses tend to find a way to reduce the impact of that. And how are they going to do that in the case of tariffs? Well, they're going to try and move from high tariff to low tariff sources, or move from any kind of tariff, high tariff, whatever, to domestic sources. Now, that's going to take time. Some of that can happen quickly. Some of it may take 5, 10, 20 years for new industries to develop, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a process that'll happen over time. So the revenue generated by any increase in tariff will sort of top out in terms of how much it can generate relative to GDP. And in fact, that tariff revenue to GDP ratio, you would expect eventually to fall if you held tariff rates constant. So yes, the tariffs are big in terms of potential revenue generation, quite significant, but not enough for us to bring our fiscal house in order in any objective sense. So will this work? Another thing that as economists, I think that we would virtually all agree, and that is tariffs and trade restrictions more generally are like sand in the wheels of commerce. And over time, you would expect those to have negative impacts on productivity globally and in the US. It may take a while for those to show up. It may take many years for those to show up in a major way. But to the extent that you're disrupting supply chains, that businesses have to find alternative sources or build out alternative supply chains, there's costs associated with that. And aren't they doing them now? Or why didn't they do them when tariffs were lower? Well, there was a reason for it. Quality reason, a cost reason, whatever it is. So you're in essence forcing up costs that has negative long-term productivity impacts. So if you combine that with the negative impacts of long-term impacts of crowding out in the budget bill, this is kind of like a long-run double whammy in terms of the long-run economic impacts of those two together. Now, can that be offset by others? Well, cutting immigration just objectively, aside from whatever you may think of that as a policy for other reasons, but just from a purely quantitative economic standpoint, cutting immigration lowers the growth of the labor force. And that would be another reason to expect weaker economic performance in the aggregate, in the sense of aggregate GDP, aggregate output, aggregate incomes. Those are going to be lower for any economy that tries to restrain population growth, whether it be through immigration or other means or restrictions on immigration. So I see challenges in the long run from these in terms of long-term economic performance. Will they be offset by some of the stimulative impacts? Hard to say, but I say if you look at just our analysis of the budget bill, there, as we've already talked about, the crowding out effects just become more and more significant, more and more painful as time goes on.
Absolutely. The other picture that you had.
So my colleague, John Rico at the Budget Lab, did this really cool analysis of the distribution effects. In this case, it's by deciles of incomes. And he sort of divided things up in terms of the impacts on income over the next decade of the budget bill. Those are the bars in blue. And the tariff increases. This is based upon tariff increases announced up through the 6th of August. And what you see is the budget bill. And by the way, this is before any economic impacts have been taken into account. This is just statically counting dollars and cents and flowing it through to personal income. So we're not taking into account crowding out effects. We're not taking into account any short-run stimulus or anything else. So what you see is the budget bill it effectively boosts income for most deciles, except at the very bottom. The two bottom deciles, the lowest 20%, actually 30%, actually suffer a loss of income from the budget bill. This is in real purchasing power over the next decade. And then the tariffs are negatively impacted because they raise costs, raise prices effectively for final goods and services, and suffuse through the supply chain. They lower real incomes, real purchasing power for all income strata, all deciles. And that's why all those red bars are shown as below the line. So then John added up the two effects, and you can see these are the numbers in circles, and they show this is the average annual change, so percent change per year on average over the next 10 years. And you can see that except for the very top decile, the top 10%, all other deciles suffer a loss in real purchasing power when you combine the effects of the tariffs with the budget bill. And I'd say if you did this analysis longer, it would get worse because the macroeconomic impacts we've talked about before, crowding out, the reduction in GDP, reduction in total incomes, becomes more and more a big part of the story here. And we tend to bring all these deciles down.
That is a really good picture. So could you maybe also give me a sense of the top decile? What is the threshold, the income threshold, annual income that we're talking about there?
In 2025 dollars, so these are based on average annual income after transfers and taxes. And I believe the top decile is above approximately 518,000. So those are average effects within a decile. But on what it's saying is on average, if your income is less than $500,000 per year,
yes,
over the next decade in measured 2025 dollars, you're going to have 518,000. You're going to have a negative impact, combined impact between the tariffs and the budget bill. The budget bill may raise your after-tax income, but tariffs are going to lower your real purchasing.
got it. I want to switch gears before we wrap up. Obviously, the Budget Lab, day in and day out, you're dealing with data. You're looking for good data. You're analyzing those data. And there does seem to be a push right now to defund or reduce the size of several data collection bodies in the government. I want to touch on the impact of this on the U.S. economic engine now and in the future. Why is the task of data collection and data distribution a public good? Why has it been a public good thus far? And is it something that could be privatized, essentially?
Well, those are some really weighty issues and questions. And I applaud you for shining a light on this issue and others, especially in recent months. Just to kind of step back a set, big picture here is I think all economists would agree, and even many non-economists would agree that the data, high quality, regularly published with transparent methodology, but that data stream that we've enjoyed is like the bread and butter of all our work. I mean, we couldn't do any kind of high quality economic analysis without the data that we can rely on. That's comprehensive, that is consistent through time, that is produced in a transparent way where we understand the methodology so we know how the data should be used and how it should be interpreted, or in some cases, its limitations. There are some limitations. For example, we cannot literally survey every single household every single month to find out what their labor market activity has been that month. It's just not practical. So we know there are always limitations, particularly in anything that's survey-based, but the U.S. has really built and enjoyed the benefits of a gold standard in terms of data, that data collection and data publishing. Doesn't mean it's perfect by any such. It doesn't mean, and I'm sure, the officials, they agree and have agreed with time that they would like to see improvements. But the U.S. has really enjoyed a benefit from that. And that is tied to that safe harbor premium, I would say, that we were talking about. So what are some of the benefits? Well, if both domestic residents and global investors and others can trust U.S. data, then they're much more likely to make well-informed decisions that they're confident in how they're interpreting what's happening. If the data become questionable for any reason, whether it's just the methodological reasons or somebody putting their thumb on the scale and tweaking the data, as we hear reports and suggestions that in other parts of the world that gets done maybe on a regular basis and pretty substantially, then you lose trust. And when you lose trust, that affects the behavior in financial markets in particular. Cost of borrowing could be higher. Risk premia could be higher. Equity prices might suffer. And then you have issues about policy decisions. So if the data stream becomes compromised, then you have a lot more cloudiness and uncertainty when you go to make decisions about major policy, i.e. the Fed. If the Fed doesn't know, is inflation 3% or is it 1.5% or is it 4%? Or did it jump 0.6 this month or did it go down 0.6? If the Fed can't have a reasonable degree of confidence in the data, it's going to have an extremely difficult time making well-informed decisions that are transparent and that can be well articulated and that the world can understand, that we as consumers, business people, investors, and so forth. So you just inject a whole many layers of uncertainty that calls into question people's confidence in the economy and in the information and the view they have of the economy.
I absolutely agree. And I think it is most certainly a national treasure, a living treasure, and a system that does serve the economy very, very well, and potentially even the world economy.
Yeah.
Well,
I like your phrasing, by the way, national treasure. Perfect. Love it. I'll have to use that.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time, Ken. I really appreciate you sharing your insights and being game to handle all of my questions. Thank you so much. And thanks to the Budget Lab for the excellent analysis and work that they do.
Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.